It's been 100 years since the Scopes trial took place, a trial that many see as a significant cultural moment in which the trial defendant, John Scopes, was used as a tool for debating a big cultural issue of the day, science versus religion, though it was also clearly a battle over who controls the curriculum in schools. I recently returned from a trip to Dayton, Tennessee, the site of this trial, which is one of the most important trials in U.S. history. There, I stood in the very courtroom that this trial took place as an invited speaker for an academic symposium spanning 2 days. What follows here is a revisiting of that speech, nearly verbatim, possibly with a few additional thoughts tacked on at the end, and without my introductory remarks to the audience. So, without further ado, I bring you Protestant responses to evolution since the Scopes trial. Well, good afternoon. It's an honor to be standing here today. I feel the weight of history in this room as I stand here charged with what has seemed to me over the past year an overwhelming task. Provide an overview of how Christians have responded to evolution since the gavel fell in this room in 1925. By necessity, I'll be presenting a history that can't touch on every source or influence or provide all the possible different interpretations. I'll be limiting my scope of my comments to Protestant responses to evolution, and maybe even more specifically, I should say, conservative Protestant denominations and institutions. In preparing to come here, I realized I've had my own misconceptions about the debate over origins and religion and science from the late 1800s and early 1900s. And I owe this correction to my thinking to a group of dedicated authors who have written so much about this time, including several speakers that are here in the room with us today. Some of those works are listed on the slide shown right here behind me, and the title should give you a sense of the broad ground that we're going to try to cover here today. I can only hope that what I present will be a helpful addition to the conversation and will stimulate you to dig deeper and learn more. So let me begin with a personal story. And it spans several generations. In the upper center of this slide is Dr. J. Gresham Machen. He was a professor at Princeton Seminary in the 1920s, the very years in which the fundamentalist modernist controversy was tearing American Protestantism apart. My grandfathers, pictured on either side, studied under J. Gresham Machen. My father's father was studied under him during his last years at Princeton Seminary. And my mother's father with him at his first years at Westminster Theological Seminary, which Machen was very instrumental in beginning when he left Princeton Seminary during this modernist fundamentalist controversy. Both of my grandfathers were instilled under Machen with a tradition of rigorous theological training. They prized biblical fidelity, or we might say in today's language, biblical authority, and intellectual curiosity, not just of scriptures, but God's other revelation, the creation itself. My father, pictured beneath Machen there, along with my mother, carried forward this particular tradition. I should note that my grandfathers both became ministers, both in the same denomination. And my father carried on that particular tradition. He was a chemistry major at Calvin College. He then went to Westminster Theological Seminary. Eventually, he accepted his first call to a small church in Grand Junction, Colorado. And it's in Grand Junction, Colorado that I grew up with marine fossils in my backyard, dinosaur fossils on the other side of town, and a deep love and appreciation for hiking and camping and exploring the natural world, which I gained from my father. So today, here I stand, a third generation, as both a Christian in the Reformed tradition, like my father, also a graduate from Calvin College, like my father, in science, like my father. However, I'm not a preacher, and hopefully it doesn't feel like I'm preaching at you today. I'm a professional biologist, and as that, I am navigating the same waters as my forefathers. I'm still feeling that tension of competing interpretations of scriptures, of the Bible, and of nature. So what's the connection to our topic? Why spend so much time on this personal history? J. Gresham Machen, I think, embodies the complex topic that I've been tasked to explore today. When William Jennings Bryan, one of the prosecuting attorneys for the Scopes trial, invited Machen to testify here in Dayton as an expert witness for the prosecution, Machen declined. And why did Machen decline to come? I believe the reasons he refused reveal a crucial missed opportunity for American Christianity and the science-faith conversation generally. First of all, he recognized his limitations. He's an expert in New Testament studies, not Old Testament theology. He also knew that he was not a biologist. He wasn't a trained scientist. And maybe more importantly, he knew he was being asked for political reasons. He was very well respected as a conservative theologian at the time, and so he knew he could be used by the prosecution to basically sound more respectable. But more importantly, Machen also believed that evolution was, in his words, kind of a side issue compared to the really important theological battles that he was fighting, namely against liberalism. So like his Princeton seminary predecessor, B.B. Warfield, and others in that particular tradition, and really most other Protestant Christians of his day, modernist or fundamentalist, Machen wasn't a young earth creationist. He likely followed the Princeton tradition of accepting the possibility of common ancestry of most living things. He believed in an ancient earth. And while both men, William James Bryan and Gresham Machen, they both vigorously opposed religious liberalism, their approaches and views very much differed. Bryan was a populist evangelical. He was deeply critical of the academy, or we might say today, of higher learning. And that included seminaries. And he believed that Darwinism was the source, as we're going to see in a moment, of the declining morality and liberalism that was rampant in the church at the time. Machen, on the other hand, was very much a scholar, grown up in a scholarly tradition, committed to demonstrating the historical and intellectual basis of Christianity. And he saw scientific inquiry not necessarily as a threat to Christianity, but as a way to actually verify Christian claims. He was vehemently opposed to liberalism, but that didn't necessarily mean he believed that all evolutionary ideas should simply be swept under the rug along with liberalism. They weren't one in the same in his mind and in the mind of many other theologians of his time. The upshot of this intro is, you should be kind of aware of who's talking to you, right? Someone who's caught between different worlds, right? Much like I see Machen as being between two very diametric opposed forces that came together representing what happened at the Scopes trial. I'm someone who's caught literally between two speakers today, which have opposing views and have very different understandings about origins. So with that, let me give you a really broad overview of what I'm going to try to cover. So this is something of a thesis statement. I'm going to say the century following the Scopes trial reveals that Christian responses to evolution or evolutionary theory, they've been characterized not by simple opposition or acceptance, all or nothing, but rather increasingly dynamic institutional struggles over how to engage the culture, in this case, the culture of evolutionary theory. There's been shifting hermeneutical approaches, that would be different interpretations, different ways to interpret scripture. And then, of course, consistent, persistent attempts to engage many scientific discoveries while also trying to maintain biblical fidelity, biblical authority. And all these are patterns that have shaped evangelical identity through especially the last 50 years, and continue to shape it today. Now, before we get to the post-Scopes 100 years, we're actually going to go back a little bit farther in time because we have to set the scene, all right, for why did we get to the point we were in 1925. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Christian responses to evolution were really far more varied than the mostly, well, I'll say, the black and white narrative that kind of emerges from the courtroom that most people remember and think about. There were many influential theologians and scientists that sought to reconcile evolutionary thought with Christian doctrine, maintaining that divine creation and evolutionary process weren't necessarily in conflict. For example, Asa Gray, Harvard botanist, outspoken Christian, early advocate of Darwinism, saw no contradiction between natural selection and divine guidance, arguing that evolution could be part of God's intentional design rather than a purely mechanistic process. By 1975, this theistic evolution, to use that word for the first time, was readily accommodated into modernist liberalist movements of many denominations. But some form of theistic evolution, and we're going to have to talk about what those different forms could be, were also part of Orthodox denominations, or at least among the theological scholars and many clergy in those denominations. One thing we're not going to be able to follow a thread, because we can't do it all, is we're not going to be able to follow sort of the scholarly trend and sort of the populist trends in terms of what people thought of evolutionary thought. We're mostly sticking to denominations, organizations, seminaries, and scholars within evangelical Christianity. You see, what many, I think, modern audiences often miss about the evolution term in the 1900s, it just wasn't exactly what we mean today. The scientific community embraced at that particular time a variety of mechanisms to explain the observed pattern of change in the fossil record. Right? I mentioned most Christians were old earth creationists of some sort. They believed the world was very old, and they recognized that there's some sort of history of organisms from relatively simple to complex. And so that pattern in the fossil record needed to be explained. And evolutionary theory provides one possible explanation for that. But at the time, Darwin's natural selection is sort of one among many possible explanations to explain the pattern or the observations of changes in organisms over time. And we're going to discuss a lot of other potential theories that Christians have held over the last 100 years. So we had neo-Lamarckianism, and we had orthogenesis. That's where evolution is driven by internal forces towards some sort of predetermined goal. We have vitalism, this idea that there's some sort of life force that's guiding development. These are non-Darwinian ideas. And these are all in the sort of the scene at the time. And so natural selection just is really one idea among many, and often not the dominant one. This, I think, may surprise many people, considering they just think like, well, Darwin came up with the origin of species by natural selection, and that was it. Like, that's all anyone's ever thought since. No, the diversity of mechanisms that existed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they actually probably made it easier for many Christians to accept some, we'll call it, form of evolution. Right? Because they could choose from versions or mechanisms that seem to provide, or preserve divine guidance and purpose, seem to avoid the anti-design elements of Darwinian evolution that was sort of looked at as being atheistic. But to get maybe at the nub of what some, I'll call them more orthodox Christians, were willing to accept at the time with respect to evolutionary theory, I think what we could do is we should just look at B.B. Warfield's comments. Right? B.B. Warfield is a Princeton theologian of the late 1800s, and here in 1888, he gave a lecture in which he talked about Darwin's ideas and evolution in general. So consider this longer quote. And I think we'll get like a detailed idea of what, you might get a detailed idea of what this theistic evolution looked like at that time. I do not think that there is any general statement in the Bible or any part of the account of creation, either is given in Genesis 1 or 2 or elsewhere alluded to, that need be opposed to evolution. This is actually a fairly famous quote. I've seen it in many places, many different papers. But if you go on in his talk, he goes to explain that a little bit more. There's no necessary antagonism of Christianity to evolution, provided that we do not hold, now here, see, provided, there's a caveat, okay? The caveat is provided that we do not hold to too extreme a form of evolution. To adopt any form that does not permit God freely to work apart from law. In other words, there are mechanisms, you could call those the providential mechanisms of how God operates the world on a normal basis. If God's not allowed to interrupt those and make changes, in other words, miracles, right? If it excludes miracles, then we can't wholesale accept this form of evolutionary theory. Where was I? Right. Work apart from law, and which does not allow miraculous intervention. And he gives a couple examples of miraculous intervention in the giving of the soul, in creating Eve. So there he's touching upon human origins, right? Animal ancestry, potentially of Adam and Eve, being excluded from evolutionary theory. if we had to give those things up, give up those miracles, what would that result in? Well, that would result in a very great lowering of the detailed authority of the Bible. But he goes on, if we condition the theory by allowing the constant oversight of God in the whole process and his occasional supernatural interference for the production of new beginnings by an actual output of creative force, producing something new, in other words, not included or in the potentiality of the preceding conditions, that's a whole bunch of words, okay? We might hold to the modified theory of evolution and be Christians in the ordinary orthodox sense. Wow. Okay, now that's a whole lot to unpack. We don't have an hour just to talk about this one paragraph. But I'll just toss in here, it's kind of difficult to know exactly what B.V. Warfield meant by occasional supernatural interference. How many times does God need to interfere in the process in order to bring about the development of all life, all right, from common ancestors? Or are there common ancestors if you're just making things along the way? Lots of questions. But nonetheless, the idea is that if God is overseeing this process, some form of evolution can be accepted and you can be an Orthodox Christian. As we'll see, I think Warfield's theistic evolution actually kind of looks more similar to maybe what we'd call today as intelligent design, or maybe even progressive creationist positions. Those are positions we will talk about in a few moments. Now, very quickly, just again, laying the groundwork for the trial and then the things we're going to talk about afterwards. By the 1920s, evolutionary ideas, at least in some form, had really penetrated into many of the institutions in American Christianity. The real division wasn't over common ancestry or common descent, but it really was, the sticking point was human origins. Shocker, right? I mean, that's the sticking point today too, as we're going to see. Did humans share physical ancestry with animals? Were we specially created? That was the question. But this theological discussion was largely confined to seminaries, educated clergy. The average churchgoer had absorbed the general idea of evolution, but they lacked the theological framework for distinguishing things like mechanism versus materialism, something that the Princeton theologians talked about a lot, including J. Gresham Machen later. Right? They couldn't distinguish between God working through natural processes and God being replaced by them, which is how it feels to many, that God is being replaced by this evolutionary concept. The gap between scholarly conservative theological engagement and popular understanding, that's going to prove to be fatal when William Jennings Bryan arrives in Dayton, right? Transforming this local legal dispute into a national referendum on Christianity and science. So that's going to bring us back to this very room where sometimes really careful distinctions of a generation of Christian scholars are going to just get swept away by this tide of cultural warfare. I should also note, in this group of papers called the Fundamentals, written between 1905 and 1915, several authors, including Warfield, wrote papers for the Fundamentals, which in essence becomes where the name fundamentalist comes from. Several authors actually espouse some version of theistic evolution. Now, that's not to say that other fundamentals were very anti-evolution, showing that there was diversity even among the fundamentalists, which we often think of as being a rather cohesive group at the time. But we need to get to the trial so we can get to the 100 years after the trial. So we don't need to rehash the whole events of the trial. We don't need to rehash the events of the trial. Many others have done that, and others have done that at this symposium. Rather, I'm just going to draw out two things. I'm going to note that the theological engagement with evolution in the early 1900s was swimming against a really strong current, all right, up against a powerful cultural current that had been created in part, maybe in large part, by Andrew Dixon White when he published his influential A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology and Christendom in 1896. Americans by this time in the 1920s certainly had absorbed his what was called the conflict thesis, the idea that science and religion were just locked in inevitable warfare throughout all time. By 1925, journalists, educators, public intellectuals, they'd internalized these views, saw disputes over evolution not as points of conversation or discussion or something to be worked through to try to understand, but as a proxy, right, for the conflict between science and religion. But more significant for our discussion, William Jennings Bryan held a particular contempt for theistic evolutionists. So let's take a look at that and maybe contrast that with what B.B. Warfield had said another 40 years earlier. Bryan, talking about theistic evolution and theistic evolutionists, said in his pamphlets or booklet, The Menace of Darwinism from 1921, which is a follow-up, or actually written at the same time as In His Image, a much larger book that explores this even more, described theistic evolution as this: an anesthetic which deadens the pain while the patient's religion is gradually being removed. But he goes on. He goes even further. He says he viewed theistic evolutionists as what? More dangerous to Christian faith than the atheist. Why is that? Because while claiming to believe in a creator, he, the theistic evolutionist, puts God so far away that the consciousness of God's presence loses its power for comfort. What does it mean to put God so far away? He is painting theistic evolution in the most deistic way possible. That God just set up the world with certain laws, and then natural selection and the other types of mechanisms just played out the tape and created all things with no input from God. Well, that puts God at a huge distance from active control in the world, right? So that form of theistic evolution, yes, places God sort of so far away from the real world that, yeah, you would lose God's presence and power to comfort in that way. He goes on, though, right? For Bryan, then, theistic evolution represented a way station on the highway that leads from Christian faith to no God land, right? To no God land. Maybe the words we would use today, the things you might hear people say today, 100 years later, would be, that's the slippery slope, right? You've stepped onto the slippery slope and you're just sliding down to atheism. So a seemingly moderate compromise to some Christians, to William James Bryan, this ultimately led believers far away from Orthodox faith. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard phrases like this or things like this that Bryan said here. I would say that I hear it all the time. I hear it all the time from somebody like, or I think it's really hard to distinguish these words from, say, the language by literal age creationists today, like Ken Ham, when he talks about theistic evolution. Now, going back to my original, reflections on my own history, I kind of wonder, whether the greatest tragedy of the Scopes trial wasn't the positions taken by either side, but the fact that there was positions that were never heard, like Machen's. The trial presented to Americans a really stark dichotomy. You either choose Bryan's populist fundamentalism, or you had to choose Darrow's secular modernism. There really was nothing in between. So I wonder whether things might have been different if J. Gresham Machen had accepted Bryan's invitation to testify as an expert witness. Would anything have changed? Would the presence of a more sophisticated theological voice altered the narrative that emerged from these proceedings? Now, I suspect probably not. And let's be honest, we don't get do-overs in history, right? But I would say we can learn from what has been lost. All right, but we got to move past 1925, and we got to see what's gone on for the past 100 years. Protestant Christianity was divided already at this time between fundamentalist and liberalist. The trial's short-term victory for the fundamentalists, didn't really lead to fundamentalist gains over time, right? The culture wars didn't end, and they weren't victorious. Rather, there was another split that was going to come. All right, this one was between fundamentalism and an emerging evangelical movement that came out of fundamentalism in the 1940s. And I think that would prove equally consequential for how Christians approached evolution going forward. What emerged was a new generation that was rather dissatisfied with some aspects of fundamentalism, right? They both, fundamentalists and evangelicals, they rejected modernist theology. But evangelicals rejected fundamentalist anti-intellectualism and, we'll say, cultural retraction, right? After this trial, kind of removing themselves really from cultural engagement and sort of becoming more inward focused and protectionist. So I'm going to use some Christian institutions to tell the story of the next 40 years. The emergence of diverse evangelical organizations through the 1940s and the 1950s marked a really significant departure from the rigid fundamentalism. It created institutional space for more engagement with questions of origins and evolution. The National Association of Evangelicals in 1942, that exemplified this shift by uniting Baptist, Wesleyans, Pentecostals, Reform groups around sort of a middle way or a third way, if you wish, between fundamentalism and liberal modernism. They advocated for unity on the theological essentials, but allowed more freedom on secondary issues, and some of those secondary issues were considered to be questions of origin, say the age of the earth, and even potentially evolution. Now, I need to go back a little bit. After 1925, evolution still was basically excluded from textbooks in many other states, and evolution wasn't talked a lot amongst conservative fundamentalist circles. And so it's really not until the evangelical movement arises and we're going to see some shifts in terms of openness to discuss evolution. It takes a long time for it to sort of resurface as a major talking point. This inclusive approach was further institutionalized through the establishment of Fuller Theological Seminary and a few other seminaries. They combine rigorous academic standards with evangelical convictions and encourage critical engagement with things like biblical scholarship and the natural sciences. In 1947, you have the Evangelical Theological Society. That's a professional society for theological discourse of PhDs that are seminary professors and so forth that gather together in annual meetings and have discussions and debates, including a debate in the early 2000s over the age of the earth, and then more debates more recently over the historicity of Adam. You have Christianity Today. All right, that was launched by Billy Graham in 1956. That provided an intellectual platform for examining scientific discussions and their theological implications. It didn't immediately champion or reject evolutionary ideas, but it provided at least a forum where people could write opinion pieces and have conversations. In 1957, Billy Graham's New York Crusade symbolized this new evangelical confidence when he reportedly said, mostly regarding evolution, the evolution question, whichever way God did it, it makes no difference. And I think this reflects the movement's, the evangelical movement's belief that you could have orthodox faith and it could thrive in conversation with modern scientific understanding, rather than just being opposed to it without discussion. So these institutional developments, they established sort of a groundwork for evangelicals' more sophisticated engagement with evolutionary science, demonstrated the biblical authority and scientific inquiry didn't need to be viewed as inherently adversarial. There certainly were many, many fights, all right, and many, many disagreements and splittings of churches and so forth that would have some elements of questions of origins involved in them. So I don't want to make it sound like everyone was like kumbaya by any means. Now, there's another important organization that begins the 1940s, and that's the American Scientific Affiliation in 1941. That was founded bringing together professional scientists, credentialed scientists, who are also Christians. And they had annual meetings, chapter meetings, get together and discuss things that you as scientists concerned with your Christian faith, how to understand science and Christian faith. And the ASA's original membership represented some really remarkably diverse individuals, everything from young earth creationists to theistic evolutionists. The statement of faith affirmed biblical authority, the basics of evangelical and even fundamentalist Christianity, but it didn't take a position on the age of the earth or the mechanisms of creation. So young earth creationists are there presenting alongside old earth creationists and even theistic evolutionists. They published papers. They have a journal, an academic journal in which they discussed topics. And there is in the early years discussions of the age of the earth and evolution in this journal. So this is the evangelical mind at work, right? Seeking faith through understanding. Now, we'll come back to the fate of some individuals within this movement in just a few moments. So entering the 1960s, much, but I won't say all, evangelicalism had established an identity that affirmed biblical inspiration, but without insisting on a literal six-day creation. This hermeneutical or openness to interpretations of scriptures included a willingness to consider things like ancient Near East context, literary criticism, various interpretive possibilities of Genesis were being proposed at this particular time. So all of these things are providing kind of the groundwork, I'll say the environment to engage again with a really hard topic, a really hard and difficult subject, evolutionary theory. Now, what I'll say about these institutions is that many of these institutions aren't what they were when they began in the 1940s, especially something like Fuller Theological Seminary. And that is a trends that we see, not just in Christian institutions, across institutions of all sorts, right? But they do represent a recurring pattern in American religious organizations that extends far beyond the specific question of evolution. Religious institutions tend to follow one of two predictable trajectories over time. The first pattern begins with sort of like these broad tent coalitions, Christianity Today, American Scientific Affiliation, and so forth. These organizations emphasize unity around some core doctrinal essential while allowing for diversity on secondary issues. However, what happens is these organizations, as they mature, internal tensions often emerge with particular constituency who feel like certain doctrines aren't secondary, but they are actually essential, right? And therefore others within the organization are compromised, right? So that dynamic typically leads to institutional fracturing, right? With splinter groups forming new organizations. This also happens to denominations. There's a reason why the Presbyterian churches of America are called the split peace, right? We have many, many, many small denominations that are splits because of disagreements over any number of different doctrinal issues. So what happens is these new organizations are really characterized by restrictive doctrinal boundaries. Now, there's a second pattern, though, and it's sort of the opposite, right? Organizations are founded on very conservative principles. We've got it all figured out. We've got these specific doctrines. We're going to hold the line against creeping liberalism, which is always the danger, right, in all conservative organizations. All right, so they start out with very conservative principles with a strong doctrinal unity among their members, but then they gradually drift toward theological liberalism over successive generations, right? And this institutional then creep often occurs as leadership changes, academic pressures mount, cultural accommodations start to increase. And then when the liberalism becomes so pronounced, traditionalist groups that are still within those organizations frequently splinter off. All right, so the same pattern. Essentially, you end up with splits that form new institutions. Many of these splits have occurred over questions about the age of the earth and how to approach evolutionary theory. So now, before we get to the 1960s, where we're going to see some of that happening, let's talk about progressive creationism. Progressive creationism emerged during this period of, I'll call it evangelical openness, as a theological response to what was at the time really growing and mounting geological and astronomical evidence for an ancient Earth. One really important book that is core to the progressive creationist movement and those that have spun off from that is this book by Bernard Ramm. In 1954, wrote The Christian View of Science and Scripture. And in that, he describes something that we call this progressive creationism. Progressive creationism, unlike six-day literalism of fundamentalists, all right, which is going to be mostly associated with fundamentalist organizations, accept deep geological time. All right, so progressive creationists are like the universe is old, the earth is old. But they believe that God created through a series of special interventions over vast epochs. After all, the world is ancient. If it's billions of years old and there's a fossil record and humans have only been around for a little bit of time, organisms have changed over time. How are we going to explain that? That could be God doing special interventions during different epochs, different eras of time, adding organisms or traits to organisms to allow them to survive in those new different environments. So this position allowed evangelicals to acknowledge the fossil record, the Earth's antiquity, right? While also preserving a belief that God is active and doing special divine acts in terms of creating complex living things. So this is often called old earth creationism. And really, I think this would be very akin to probably what something like William Jennings Bryan believed, and many other Christians of the time, who are all believe that the world is old and yet still needed some explanation for why then there is this changing diversity of organisms over time. So adherents argued that God employed both natural mechanisms. So they would actually discuss like how much of the change in organisms is by purely natural mechanisms or God's normal providential operations versus supernatural intervention, which he creates new kinds of organisms at maybe strategic points throughout Earth's history. But how many interventions? You know what? Doesn't this sound a whole lot like what I read from B.B. Warfield in his description of theistic evolution, right? If God's allowed to intervene at different times where maybe natural mechanisms can't do the work, that's essentially progressive creationism. So this position really became very popular in evangelical academia through the 1950s, up until the 60s, provided some, I'd say, respectability for some Christian conservative organizations and institutions who didn't want to be associated with what was now beginning to grow a young earth creationist movement. But progressive creationist influence, I think, dramatically starts to drop off a bit in 1961 with the publication of The Genesis Flood, right? Because that reinvigorates the young earth creationist perspective, really brings it into the consciousness of the average churchgoer. All right. And it positions young earth creationists as the truly biblical alternative versus the progressive creationists, which was the truly biblical alternative to theistic evolution of the time. So today, while some evangelicals still hold a form of progressive creationist views, sometimes called day-age views, most notably Hugh Ross and his organization Reasons to Believe, which is still quite popular. There's many chapters of that. But he believes in an ancient earth, but is skeptical of evolutionary theory. I think it's really popular among, I'll call it lay Christians, but doesn't have a lot of like strong institutional support that it once enjoyed. And I think it is overshadowed by the polarization between what is coming, which is young earth creationists versus what we'll call evolutionary creation or theistic evolution. All right, so that brings us to the 1960s, right? 1960 through the year 2000. I call this the rise of young age creationism and a new anti-evolution wave that is beginning, just as evolution is beginning to be discussed again. So it's a watershed moment. 1961. That's a year that would fundamentally alter the landscape of conservative Christian engagement with science. John Whitcomb and Henry Morris, they published The Genesis Flood. That transformed what had been a relatively marginal position at this point within conservative Christianity into a movement that would capture the imagination of millions. This isn't just another book about biblical interpretation, right? This is a manifesto that reframed the entire discussion by wrapping young earth creationism in the language of modern science. Now, what makes this movement so significant is not that it introduced young earth creationist views to Christianity. I mean, these perspectives had already existed. And the speaker after me, Todd Wood, will discuss the history of young earth creationism in much more detail than I can here. I'll just say that the Genesis Flood accomplished something really unprecedented. It convinced broad evangelical audiences that accepting an old earth was tantamount to compromising biblical authority, right? That is the mantra of young earth creationism. An old earth is tantamount to denying biblical authority. So I think that this marks the expansion of creationism into the consciousness of a much broader Christian audience. First, it spread rapidly through fundamentalist circles, but it then began to creep in mostly as a grassroots movement into evangelical denominations over the next 4 decades. The effect is quite dramatic, particularly among a place like, you can see it in the American Scientific Affiliation, which remember started in 1941. But in 1963, ASA members who had embraced the Genesis Flood and were talking about it and bringing it up in meetings and writing papers about this in the journal, became really frustrated with the organization's openness now to old earth views and evolutionary perspectives, because after all, that's a threat to biblical authority. It becomes an essential rather than a secondary issue. So the theological framework that allowed figures like B.B. Warfield to distinguish between evolution as a process and evolution as a worldview seem now like a dangerous compromise. So as I said before, in 1963, something happened. Well, those young earth creationists removed themselves from the American scientific affiliation and began their own society, the Creation Research Society. And that represented those who favored a strictly literalist interpretation of Genesis. And ever since then, young earth creationists have their own institutions, their own organizations, their own literature, their own journals. So from 1961 to the 1980s, I would say that the age of the earth became really the defining issue among conservative evangelical denominations. The focus, I think, was strategically brilliant on the part of young earth creationists. If the world's young, if they focused on the age of the earth, not on evolution, if the world is young and you can show that the world is young, well then, yeah, you can't have any serious discussion about evolution. It wouldn't make any sense, right? Evolution does need more time. At least the mechanisms we know about, we need a lot more time than 10,000 years or 6,000 years. So Whitcomb and Morris effectively shifted the debate in the church from the mechanism of creation to the chronology of creation. It forced Christians to choose between the scientific consensus on one side and what was presented as biblical authority or biblical fidelity. Sound familiar? It sounds a little bit like 1925. I mean, the consequences of the shift, they just cannot be overstated. Where earlier generations of Christians had begun to wrestle with complex questions about divine action, natural law, biblical interpretation, all of a sudden there's a new generation being offered a really stark binary again. Young earth equals faithful Christian. Old earth compromise with secular humanism. As I said before, the parallels between the 1990s and the early 1900s, you just can't ignore them. It's the same sentiment that Bryan expressed about theistic evolution. It is the way station on the way to no God land. You're on the slippery slope. Now, my own experience with two conservative Presbyterian denominations illustrates this broader transformation or this time of change from the 1960s all the way up through 2000. Both the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and the Presbyterian Church of America were forced into extensive debates about Genesis and creation through the 1990s. Debates within churches, debates within presbyteries, motions, conflict. Right? Each denomination ultimately had to establish a study commission to examine the range of acceptable creation interpretations. And they both concluded that a diversity of views on the age of the earth were acceptable within the confessional boundaries, that it wasn't heretical to believe that the world was old, and it was okay to believe that the world was young. That both of those were acceptable interpretations of Genesis. However, they did still place strict limits on the extent to which common ancestry evolution could be endorsed, and both took pretty strong stances against any suggestion of animal ancestry of humans. Now, I show this particular slide because these are the covers of the two study reports from those two organizations, and you just look down here and you see, like, what did they look at? Well, here's a description of the calendar day interpretation, the day-age interpretation, the framework interpretation, the analogical days interpretation, and other interpretations of creation days, which over the past 20 years now has actually proliferated into multiple other views of how to interpret the first couple chapters of Genesis. And so my father's experience in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, I think, provides a particularly illuminating window into these institutional changes across these 5 decades. Because in the 1970s, he could comfortably maintain a form of old earth creationist view without really facing any questions about his orthodoxy. He was a pastor for some 50 plus years now. But the growing influence of young earth creationists in the 1980s meant that many pastoral candidates who were coming through the presbytery in which he was at and being examined by fellow pastors before being accepted to take calls to churches. Many pastors with identical views to his were being rejected during presbytery examinations. not for any other form of theological heterodoxy, but for their particular positions on creationism, mostly because they were not espousing young earth creationists. This pattern of this change in the attitude and the environment as congregations become more attuned to young earth creationism and expect then for their pastor, the person they're going to call as a minister, to also share that view. That results in a change in the feeling within these denominations. And they're not the only one. It's across multiple other evangelical institutions. In 2004 and in 2000, when these study reports came out and they allowed for some diversity and said you couldn't basically deny somebody a pastorship for these particular views, that helped. But yet there's still a strong contingent of young earth creationists remaining very influential in these denominations. And that assures that the conversation will continue to go, and it's going to continue to be marked by tension. And it is. There is no resolution to this day on these issues. Now, before we step into the 2000s, there's one other movement we need to address briefly. As young earth creationism institutionalized through organizations like the Institute for Creation Research, Answers in Genesis, there was another approach that was emerging in the early 1990s. And that also greatly affects theological thinking about evolution. The intelligent design movement emerged in the early 1990s as a non-explicitly Christian approach to challenging naturalistic evolution. And they did that through purportedly scientific methods rather than biblical literalism. It's pioneered by figures like Philip Johnson and Michael Behe. Intelligent design strategically avoided explicit religious language, while they argued that certain features of biological complexity bore the hallmarks of intelligence or intelligent design, right? An intelligent cause, rather than just undirected natural processes, in their words. Unlike young earth creationism, which defended specific biblical chronologies, or theistic evolution, which accepted evolutionary mechanisms as God's chosen method, intelligent design focused exclusively on detecting design through scientific analyses, attempting to demonstrate empirically that an unspecified designer, not the Yahweh God, but whoever you think God is, was necessary to account for life's complexity. The movement's primary strategic objective centered around integrating intelligent design theory into public school science curriculum as a legitimate scientific alternative to evolutionary theory. Thereby, they were challenging what proponents viewed as the materialistic assumptions dominating contemporary biological education. ID achieved some pretty considerable public attention throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. They garnered support from diverse religious constituencies who appreciated their critique of purely naturalistic explanations without requiring a commitment to specific theological frameworks. However, the movement's most significant legal challenge culminated in a really decisive defeat in 2005 in Kitzmiller versus Dover. That ruled that the intelligent design constituted religious advocacy rather than legitimate science and couldn't be taught in public schools. Since this legal setback, idea proponents have continued to publish popular books and maintain institutional presence through organizations like the Discovery Institute, but I don't think the movement's achieved any significant new inroads into scientific or educational circles. But it has continued to influence popular evangelical and fundamentalist thinking, especially about evolution among lay Christians. Lay Christians find their arguments, I think, against purely materialistic interpretations of biological complexity quite compelling. So before moving on to the 2000s, let's just say that the institutional history matters because it shapes our present moment. Every Christian organization dealing with origins questions today, they inherit a legacy of division. The difficult middle ground of allowing diverse interpretations that attempt to maintain theological orthodoxy at the same time, while also allowing space for members and institutions to examine new evidence and ideas, that really struggles to find institutional homes and sustain funding. So we've arrived at our current moment. Churches are still splitting over creation views. Seminary professors are still signing detailed statements on their Genesis interpretation. Christian schools are still choosing curricula based on origins positions. The very things that earlier figures like Machen had tried to avoid, like making evolution the central battle of Christian orthodoxy, they've come to pass. But even as these divisions deepened, there's new voices emerging in the 21st century, attempting once again to engage in dialogue about evolution and Christian faith. So let's get to that. The rise of BioLogos, and we'll call it contemporary evolutionary creationism. The 21st century has witnessed, I would say, an unprecedented expansion of Christian discussions of evolutionary theory, particularly regarding human origins. This period has necessitated, therefore, a substantial theological reflection on many doctrines that evolutionary science challenges. Some of these are shown here, right? I'd say I'd lump them together like three different main challenges persist. And it's not like these challenges haven't always been around, but they're really brought forth by the continuing and more open discussion of evolutionary theory. So you have theodicy, which poses this fundamental question. If God employed evolutionary processes in creation, how do Christians then reconcile the extensive suffering and extinction evident in the fossil record with divine benevolence? Yeah, wife suffering. Here you see a couple representative books, all published in the 2000s here, that are significant contributions to the discussion within evangelical Christianity. I happen to know that there's another one on the way in the not too distant future addressing this question. There's also the question of human uniqueness. How do Christians understand being made in the image of God? If science demonstrates our shared common ancestry with other primates, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? That's a question that all evolutionary creationists must face. And then there's original sin. Without a historical fall involving the first human pair, the question arises, how do Christians explain universal human sinfulness and the need especially for redemption? These discussions have all permeated denominational statements, academic conferences, study groups, generating extensive scholarly literature and ongoing debates that continue to shape contemporary conservative Christianity. So into this new debate, new openness about discussing evolutionary theory among, I'll say, the evangelical community, we find Francis Collins, former atheist, distinguished genome scientist, directed the Human Genome Project, eventually the National Institutes of Health, became a convert to Christianity. And in 2006, he wrote a book, The Language of God, A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. And in that, he provided a very influential personal testimony about his faith journey. The book became a cultural phenomena, achieved bestseller status, and that gave many evangelicals intellectual permission to maybe consider evolutionary theory seriously. He talked a lot about evolutionary theory in his book. And there he coined a new term, biologos, right? It's derived from the Greek bios, which means life, and logos, which means word. And so he's conceptualizing life as emerging through the word of God, with evolutionary processes serving as God's creative language. And in 2007, supported by funds from the Templeton Foundation, he established yet another Christian organization that thinks about science and faith called the BioLogos Foundation to promote specifically the integration of evolutionary science and Christian faith. So this organization has a pretty narrow mission. At least it starts out with a fairly narrow mission. I'd say they have a much larger vision today, almost 20 years later now. So this movement is much more than just a society of, Christian scientists like the American Scientific Affiliation. It explicitly and maybe strategically goes out and attracts influential theological allies, pastors and theologians that have a fairly large platform and are theologically conservative. And though they don't all agree on all points of the mantra of maybe evolutionary creation, they at least engage in discussions about it, provide critiques, and allow for further thought, come together with scientists. So there's meetings that come together to have individuals from different perspectives come together and talk. So out of some of those discussions come some fairly important books that then have continued influence. So especially this one, Evolutionary Creation, a Christian Approach to Evolution by Dennis Lamoureux. And that's where this term evolutionary creation comes from, which you might think is maybe synonymous with theistic evolution. And you could certainly make an argument for that the two kind of mean the same thing. There's a lot of overlap between individuals that would call themselves evolutionary creationist versus theistic evolutionist. The idea is that you're placing the emphasis on creationist rather than on the word evolution, right? You're evolutionary. Evolution is the mechanism of creation itself. I think there's also merit to a new term for Christians who want to discuss and accept aspects or all of evolutionary theory, because the word theistic evolution had become so misused and overused, and is such a massive broad tent. There are certainly, I mean, it goes well beyond just Christianity. A theistic evolution is just, if there's evolution and a God is involved in that at all, you could be a theistic evolutionist. And it included, those who would probably call deists in that group. Evolutionary creationism kind of begins as a movement that is explicitly Christian and a more conservative element of Christianity. And so they're saying we're saying that God is a little more actively involved. They're saying God is a little more actively involved than it might be under some of the larger umbrella of a theistic evolution. I don't know. That's just my take of what the possible difference between the two is. Maybe I'll let BioLogos speak for itself, because here's stuff right from their website. What is evolutionary creation? God is the creator and sustainer of all things. He made the world. And evolution is the best scientific explanation for the relatedness of life on Earth. We're going to accept that the idea of common ancestry is the best explanation we know of, a scientific explanation we know of, to explain the observations about life on Earth. And maybe a little more specifically then, evolutionary creationism is a Christian position on origins. It takes the Bible seriously as inspired and authoritative word of God. It takes science seriously as a way of understanding the world God has made. Evolutionary creationism includes two basic ideas. First, that God created all things, including human beings in his own image. And notably, it's not saying exactly how they believe man is created there. So it's a little bit open to interpretation. And second, that evolution is the best scientific explanation we currently have for the diversity and similarities of all life on Earth. So this would be, I'll say, the most modern definition of theistic evolution, called evolutionary creationism now. Now, within this particular camp, questions still remain. And the most hotly debated question is, to no one's surprise, the question of human origins, right? It remains the most challenging issue for all evolutionary creationists and theistic evolutionists. All right, here's just a smattering of some of the books that have been written in the last decade. Hot topic over the last decade. We got The Lost World of Adam and Eve by John Walton, who had written several blockbuster type books on interpretations of Genesis earlier. We have Joshua Swamidas's The Genealogical Adam and Eve from 2021. That has been much talked about, much discussed book. We have a number of different perspectives books that compare different views on historical Adam and Eve. We've got William Lane Craig, a well-known Christian apologist, entered the fray in 2021 with the quest for historical Adam. Peter Enns, Evolution of Adam. We have the influence of genetics on the question of the evolution of Adam, or the historicity of Adam, with Adam in the genome. All right. So much more genetic data. And that's one thing also that contributes to the fact that this topic of the history of Adam and Eve is suddenly discussed much more now, because the Human Genome Project and a mound of new evidence that now everyone must sort of filter through and consider how to react to it. And those reactions aren't all like, hey, it's Adam and Eve are evolved from apes. There's also responses to all these books that discuss the scientific evidence for animal ancestry of Adam and Eve. And so the genetic data is one of the influences. The other influence, I'll just say, is that from the 1990s and into the early 2000s, we have a little bit of a drop off of the age of the Earth question. especially as I showed you, even conservative denominations are coming out with statements that, the age of the earth is something that we don't think is a central issue. It's not an essential, and there can be diversity. The scriptures allow for a diversity of interpretations. And so the question is turning then to evolution, because that's where the sticky issue is. And so evolution begins to be discussed a lot more. And also for all the other reasons I gave about the rise of evangelicalism and so forth, right? So all of that is causing evolution generally to be discussed more. You add on top of that genetics, and all of a sudden you have anti-evolutionary critics are going to go for the jugular, and the main place you're going to go is historicity of Adam, right? That is the place where all discussions end up. And that's why all of a sudden, boom, proliferation of books about Adam and Eve. And that continues to the present. And the response to this increased attention paid to theistic evolution and evolutionary creationism also creates a need for anti-evolutionary movements to respond to that new form of theistic evolution. So that creates an additional proliferation of books in the last. And when I was in Dayton, I actually skipped this part about Bill Nye and Ken Ham due to time constraints, but I'm going to go ahead and say a little bit about them and how they fit into this whole last 100 years. The persistence of creation evolution debates really became strikingly apparent on February 4th, 2014. So this also shows you that the age of the earth debate is still, it's not gone away. All right. I said that it's tailed off and the evolution is more freely discussed. But the age of the earth and evolution from a young earth creationist perspective is still plenty alive today. In February 4, 2014, Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis, young earth creationist, challenged Bill Nye, the science guy, to a debate. Is creation a viable model of origins, was the question. And they did this debate at the Creation Museum in Kentucky. Now, the parallels to the Scopes trial, they're pretty remarkable, right? You've got a celebrity scientist, Bill Nye, right, confronting a populist defender of biblical creationism, Ham. Clarence Darrow was the defense lawyer, and he was charismatic and well-known at the time, and he was a celebrity lawyer, right? And you have William Jennings Bryan, who's one of the prosecutors, right? And he's defending the sort of traditional view, defending religion, right? It had massive media attention. Yeah, the Scopes trial had massive media attention. 3 million viewers watched this thing live online. Made it one of the top trending topics on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, all simultaneously. But there's definitely differences between this. William Jennings Bryan in 1925 advocated for old earth creationism. I mean, just outright said that the world was old in that trial. He focused on evolution's social implications, not really on like a critique of the scientific claims themselves. Ken Ham defends a young earth creationism, and he uses arguments about DNA information, distinguishing between things like observational and historical science, were you there, and all his typical arguments. Bill Nye possessed a lot more scientific evidence than Clarence Darrow could have ever have imagined in 1925. He had complete genome sequence, transitional fossils, documented speciation events, and so forth. Yeah, the debate occurred not in a legal courtroom, but in a privately funded museum. And it reflected how fundamentalists had constructed, at this point, parallel institutions following the post-Scopes retreat from, they say, mainstream academia. And Creation Research Society had retreated from the American Scientific Affiliation. And then all these other young earth creationist organizations have sprung up. And although Ken Ham's organization is very much of a culture warrior sort of organization trying to shape the culture, they don't really engage with culture. They simply have here's the truth and here's therefore this is what culture thou shalt do. I guess the aftermath of this debate is just further polarization, just like in the Scopes trial, results in polarization between two sides. Online polls showed that 92% of respondents favored Nye's scientific arguments, but Gallup surveys indicated that 40 to 47% of Americans still believe that God created humans in their present form within the last 10,000 years. Which is remarkably similar, actually, to the 1925 position of Americans. It is a little bit less, but it's not significantly so. Now, of course, critics argued that Nye had legitimized Ham's position by simply even engaging in the debate altogether. That happens to be my position. And that echoes the same concerns after the Scopes trial, in which individuals said that the Scopes trial inadvertently elevated fundamentalist public profile rather than damaging the profile of Protestants. They dug in, right? And the other side dug in as well. And we see that with the outcomes of Bill Nye and Ken Ham. So it's 2025. What have we learned? What have we learned? 100 years later, we've got to ask, what's really changed? I'd say the similarities are really sobering. There's still deep polarization between science and faith camps. Media sensationalism still drives our narratives. Now it's Twitter or X wars instead of newspaper headlines. Political exploitation of this divide continues. Politicians love to use the stark differences between science and faith in order to cobble support for getting votes. That's because identity markers still trump, right, real engagement with these topics. And yeah, we're still fighting battles over science education standards. The institutional landscape has undergone a dramatic restructuring over the past century. The 1925 Christian community operated with, I'd say, relatively centralized authority structures dominated by denominational seminaries that controlled doctrinal oversight and really fairly limited opportunities for lay theological participation. The average person didn't have much of an opportunity to engage in serious theological conversations that would influence the church. And by contrast, in 1925, the environment exhibits significant institutional fragmentation. There's multiple competing organizations. There's like BioLogos, there's Reason to Believe, Angels in Genesis, Discovery Institute, and a whole bunch of different denominations that are split offs from each other. They're all vying for influence. The decentralization has coincided with greater educational diversity too, right? We've got Christian schools. We've got the homeschooling movement, which you would love to talk about the influence of that on this whole discourse. We've got secular universities. And all along, we have the democratization of theological authority where digital platforms enable really broad participation in theological discourse, often under the influence of what? Celebrity pastors who have like platform-based authorities. We have individuals that have no theological training who are very influential voices within the church and within institutions. Ken Ham himself is not trained as a scientist or a theologian, yet has an enormous voice within the church. And I'm not saying in the 1920s that those individuals didn't exist either, but that was not nearly as common, and it wasn't as easy for somebody to get that kind of platform at that time. So in our present climate, honestly, I'm not too optimistic that we're going to fare much better than our predecessors. But the next century does demand that we wrestle with a little more light and less heat than our predecessors. In this historic room where positions harden into battle lines, I hope all of us, that's Christians and non-Christians alike, can commit to at least better dialogue. I don't expect agreement. There's not going to be agreement, but you can have better dialogue and we can learn. I expect that the 200th anniversary, many of the same words that I've just said are going to be spoken again with equal conviction. The dialogue between science and faith, it's not ending. It just continues to evolve. Each generation has to struggle with the question of origins, like who are we and how do we share those stories with each other? So the trial's over. And I think the conversation continues. And my question to you is, how are you going to contribute? Thank you. And so if you're still with me, thanks for hanging on. And after returning from Dayton, I have a short amount of time here in which I need to prepare for going to Wheaton College for a whole week. And I'm involved in a fellows program there where I'm going to be doing a lot of theological training. And I have a lot of readings to do. And one of those readings is this book right here, introducing evangelical theology by Daniel Trayer. It's basically a romp through all the major Christian doctrines, giving a variety of perspectives that are all evangelical perspectives on those. And the reason I bring this up is because I just today got to this page 139, and it's actually a section on the doctrine of creation. And he's talking about changing perspectives on evolution by Christians. And so, of course, I was like, yeah, I'm interested to see what he has to say. Will this agree with some of the things that I just presented at Dayton? So I'm going to read this 2/3 of a page in his words about the history of Protestant reactions to evolution. To generalize, theological responses to Darwin's revolution have unfolded in 3 phases, which reflect in the meaning of theistic evolution over time. Initially, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that's where I began in my discussion, theistic evolution could involve openness, even among conservative theologians, to God's superintending use of evolutionary processes. Such thinkers insisted on distinguishing between evolutionary science per se and a materialistic worldview or denial of divine intervention. That's exactly what I read from B.B. Warfield in his description of theistic evolution. In a second phase, the Scopes trial of 1925 heightened emerging evangelical controversy. The fundamentalist modernist battle drove evangelicals away from mainstream academic and cultural engagement. I spoke about that. Fundamentalists popularly embraced literal interpretations of Genesis, while modernists took theistic evolution into virtual deism. And I didn't talk about that, but the modernist liberalists, they pretty much took in evolutionary theory quite quickly, but it quickly became just a very deistic form, which meant we'll accept everything was just happened by purely naturalistic mechanisms, and God is simply the author of the naturalistic mechanisms from the beginning. He's not involved in the process. He's not involved in his creation. And so that's why he's saying became virtual deism, that God started a process and then backed off and left it alone. In the 1950s, creation science became the polar opposite of such deistic evolution. Mediating figures like Bernard Ramm acknowledged scientific evidence for an old Earth, even for evolutionary processes, while retaining active divine involvement, especially in the creation of humans. That's progressive creationism, right? Often such mediating figures spoke of progressive creationism, which encompassed the day, age, and gap theories. I didn't talk about those, but those are the different theological frameworks for trying to understand Genesis in the idea of that the earth is ancient, but God is doing these intervening steps. These theories tend to be concordantist, meaning the day-age theory, like each day represents a large amount of time, and so represents literally that God is creating in that order of the 7 days, but over long periods of time. So that's concordantism. These theories tend to be concordist, attempting to reconcile particular details in Genesis with modern scientific evidence. In a third recent phase, theistic evolution has encompassed various positions. Among evangelicals, it is giving way to evolutionary creation as a preferred label. This label more clearly emphasizes God's action, speaking of creation as a noun. As an adjective, evolution indicates a means of God's action, that the actual evolutionary processes are God's means of action in a sovereign way where God is in control of all things versus a deistic approach. So that's just, this chapter is not meant to be like all encompassing on that history. That is like a 1-pager, well, less than a 1-pager, sort of broad overview of the major influences of Protestant Christianity and their reactions to evolution. I'd say I felt pretty good after reading that because that's very similar to the talk that I just gave, that I just recorded here. So I thank you for listening. I have learned a lot through this process over the past year. I've read a tremendous number of books and a number of articles. There are so many other strains of thought that need to be talked about, but you can only do so much in the 1-hour time constraint that I had. I did go a little over an hour with this one. this re-rendering of it. But I have a lot of fodder for future videos through this, because I have some other thoughts that I have written down, and I have some other partial manuscripts that I'll probably explore in future videos, in which we'll take some tangents off of the things I've just said. All right, I think that's it. Again, thanks. I appreciate your time. I'm going to be really busy the next couple of weeks, so I don't think there'll be a lot of videos coming out from me, but when I get back, I should be full of fresh ideas. So till then, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.